Hi, this is Nick Ragone with This Date in History. June 6, 1944, one of the most recognizable and important days of the 20th century. D-Day, the liberation of continental Europe from the grip of Nazi Germany. The beginning of the end for Hitler and his Third Reich. Most of us are familiar with the countless stories of heroism, bravery, sacrifice, and loss from that fateful day, and in the weeks and the months that would follow. This is the untold story of how we got there, of the leaders and the events, the planning and the persistence, of fate and chance. This is the story of General Dwight Eisenhower's two letters.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
June 6, 1944, one of the most important and identifiable dates of the 20th century. It would mark a turning point in the European theater of World War II, the liberation of continental Europe from Nazi Germany. D-Day.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of Communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
Codenamed Operation Overlord, the effort was orchestrated by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower, who had the unenviable task of coordinating the most complicated and riskiest military operation of this or any other war, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. Contrary to popular belief, it was never a foregone conclusion that the four-star general would actually lead such a monumental effort. As late as 1939, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower was a mere bit player in the United States preparation for the looming conflict across the ocean. With nearly 400 generals that outranked Eisenhower, few would have predicted that it would be the 49-year-old career administrator, a man with no battlefield command experience, who would lead the most pivotal military operation of the 20th century. That is, except for George C. Marshall, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Franklin Roosevelt's most trusted military advisor, and Eisenhower's future mentor. Though he barely knew Eisenhower, Marshall saw in Ike both a diplomat and strategist, a disciplined, decisive leader who could bring the Allied fighting forces together and harmonize them as one. When he plucked Ike from obscurity to be a key strategist on his war staff following the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor in December of '41, even Marshall couldn't have predicted how quickly the resourceful Eisenhower would ascend the ranks. As Eisenhower tackled one assignment after another, Marshall grew increasingly reliant on his now protege to aggressively prosecute the Allied effort and weaken the Nazis' stronghold in Europe. In 1943, President Roosevelt surprised everyone when he tapped Eisenhower, and not George Marshall, to be the supreme Allied commander in Europe, the person responsible for dismantling the Nazi war machine once and for all. FDR's intuition proved correct. Ike was the best man suited to lead the Allied coalition's full frontal invasion of France.
The Tunisian front, a quagmire of mud. The Commander-in-Chief, American General Dwight Eisenhower, discussing plans for the final offensive. Always to be found where the fighting is heaviest, General Eisenhower has won the admiration and respect of his officers and men. Here is a general trained to fight a mechanized war. Already the wily Rommel has felt the power of his arms.
Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin had been pleading for a second front in France, almost as soon as the Nazi forces invaded Russia in June of 1941. With the Soviet forces exhausted, depleted, and on the verge of collapse, they were desperate for an Allied landing across the English Channel to ease their load. Talk of a second front in Europe picked up steam at the Quebec Conference in August of 1943. With FDR pressing the issue, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill reluctantly consented to a coastal invasion of France, though he did so with strong reservations about the likelihood of success. The decision was cemented at the Tehran gathering in December of that year. It was there that Churchill and Roosevelt first informed Stalin of Operation Overlord, though they provided few details about the location, timing, or who would even lead the critical expedition. Stalin was critical when the two refused to name a commander. Then nothing will come of these operations. Who carries the moral and technical responsibility for this operation? Planning for the liberation of Europe would begin in earnest in the winter and early spring of 1944. The scale and logistical complexity of the operation was beyond anything ever attempted, and it would take all of Eisenhower's genius to pull it together in a matter of only months. Even as late as then, there wasn't total consensus among the Allied leadership that a risky and unprecedented coastal landing in France was the best way to go. Churchill, for one, still harbored many of the reservations that he had been carrying for years about an amphibious assault of continental Europe. It was too risky, too complicated, and likely to fail. While he was outwardly supportive in meetings, in private he lamented the untold lives it would cost. I then realized for the first time that Mr. Churchill hadn't believed in it all along, and had had no faith that it would succeed. It was quite a shocking discovery. Eisenhower would confide in his diary a month before the invasion. But if unconditional surrender was the ultimate goal, the road to victory would have to go through Paris. There was no way around it. An operation this complex, this pivotal, this risky would have to be planned in total secrecy. The element of surprise, when and where, was the only real advantage the Allies had. The entrenched and fortified Nazis, dug in and resolute, held most of the cards, which meant the Allies only had one shot at executing an audacious beach landing in France. Debate raged over the best landing spot for Overlord. Pas-de-Calais? Brittany? The Cotentin Peninsula? Normandy. With its sloping sandy beaches, Normandy offered a more receptive, though still harsh terrain for an amphibious landing. Its proximity to the Isle of Wight, with its naval ports and railways in southern England, made for convenient troop and supply transport for the impending armada. But perhaps most importantly, the Allied leadership believed Normandy would catch the German High Command off guard. Hitler and his general staff suspected the landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point between France and England, and a seemingly natural place for a cross-channel expedition. And to that end, the Allies made sure of it with Operation Fortitude, the elaborate and well-documented deception campaign of phantom armies and phantom movements that all but convinced the German High Command that the main thrust would be in Calais. So serious was the subterfuge that George Patton, the most celebrated and respected Allied field commander, was pulled from the battlefield and redeployed as a decoy. The deception had worked. The weather was a different story, the one variable that Eisenhower and his staff had no control over. Planners had to factor tides, the time of day, and the phase of the moon, with satisfactory conditions for a landing occurring only a few days each month. With such a narrow window for launch, precise weather forecasting could make or break the Allied effort. Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, played a pivotal and underappreciated role in the story of D-Day. Ike had chosen June 5th, the first opportunity, in a narrow 3-day go window, but reluctantly postponed only hours before giving the order on the Council of Stagg, who believed severe weather was barreling toward the Channel, though his American counterparts disagreed. Stagg's prescient call averted catastrophe, and when he saw a brief respite the following day, Eisenhower pounced, giving the order to launch the Armada across the English Channel. And with that, the liberation of Europe had begun. Historians have forever debated if the person makes the moment or the moment makes the person. It's a tautology more than a question, one without an answer. But it's hard to argue against Dwight Eisenhower being fitted for the times. Marshall plucked him from obscurity. Roosevelt put his faith in him. His men trusted him, and Ike reciprocated in kind. Late in the evening of June 5th, after he had given the final order to proceed, Eisenhower hastily scribbled a note. "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He put the note in his wallet, never to be used.
Of course, June 6 was just the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. It would take days of intense and bloody fighting for the Allies to finally secure the Normandy beachhead, and weeks more of grueling, treacherous combat to ultimately break through the difficult terrain and fierce German resistance in the march towards Paris. It came with a cost. Over 4,000 men lost their lives on that first day alone, with another 6,000 wounded. It would be the single bloodiest day in the history of the United States military. By the time the Allies recaptured Paris in late August, 70,000 men had lost their lives, with another 150,000 wounded. For this date in history, I'm Nick Ragone.